Hi everyone, so I'm going to be talking about open questions in bridging systems. Bridging systems are a generalization of the idea of bridging-based ranking, which you may have heard of. It's essentially the hypothesis that ranking content more highly in a recommender system, that when it, in some sense, bridges divides between people, that's a good thing for democracy, for plurality, for social cohesion. And this is very much joint work with Avivo Vajja, and it also builds on the work of Jonathan Stray, who's done work on depolarizing recommender systems, and Jonathan's here as well today. So I'm going to start with a story which is completely uncited and made up, but somewhat plausible. So in the human ancestral environment, conflicts between tribe members would have been mediated by an elder or similarly respected figure who would articulate frames and perspectives which serve to blunt any innate tendencies towards outrage or contempt. The role they performed would be one of bridging, increasing mutual understanding and trust across divides, and creating space for productive conflict deliberation and cooperation. The bridging property is one that is arguably missing from, or lacking in many modern communication systems, particularly recommender systems on social media, most of which primarily seek to maximize attention or engagement. So over the past year, Aviv and I have been thinking about how we can sort of provide a general framework for informing how we can go about building bridging into existing systems that allocate human attention, and enumerating many of the interesting open problems. So I'll be talking about that today. Oops. So in our framework, bridging is a property of what we call attention allocators. It's something that comes in degrees, and attention allocators can be more or less bridging. I'll give you 3 examples of systems which we view as attention allocators, or can be modeled as attention allocators. The first is inhuman facilitated deliberative bodies, such as citizen assemblies. The second is online collective response systems, such as Polis. And the third are recommender systems on social media. And all these systems, in some way, can be viewed as systems for allocating human attention. And they share a common framework, which is that they start with a set of potential attention events. That is, they start with, or they consider some set of possible ways of allocating some finite resource, such as positions within a recommender system ranking, or our own human first-person attention. And for each of those possible ways or allocations, they predict the impacts of allocating that attention resource in a certain way. They have some formal or qualitative value model of how to aggregate and trade off those various impacts against one another. And then they use that sort of aggregate measure of attention worthiness to select what attention events actually take place. And this framework is useful because it makes it very clear what needs to happen to incorporate bridging incentives into these systems. Fundamentally, you need to care about bridging, which means you have to include bridging impacts and give them sufficient weight within your value model. To do that, you need to be making the impacts about bridging in the first place. So you need to predict bridging impacts. And to do that, you probably need some models of the state of relationships in a population, and be able to predict based on, or if a given attention event occurs, how those relationships will change over time. I'm just going to whiz through some of the open problems that this raises, and hopefully give you a sense of how many interesting questions there are, many of them probably PhD worthy. So the first set of open problems relates to the model of relationships in a population that you're using. When we don't prescribe any particular type of model, but 2 common variants are graph-based and space-based models, as shown here. There's questions about how we elicit the data for such models. Most online platforms at the moment currently elicit data based on engagement from users, so measurable behaviors such as clicks, etc. It's not clear whether this data is sufficient for bridging. Does it capture the right kinds of characteristics of human relationships which we care about to sort of improve social cohesion or reduce destructive conflict? There might be other elicitation methods required. There's the problem of, if you're trying to understand the impact of showing someone something, you have to show it to them and see what happens. And so your system of measuring the world also changes the world, and if you're doing this at scale, you might need to account for that somehow. There's questions about whether we should model people as clustered into discrete groups, or whether we represent them as individuals in some more continuous space, and whether either of those approaches is more appropriate in different contexts. And there's also open questions about the fundamental limitations of such models. So for example, in my PhD work, I've shown that certain preference profiles are just fundamentally unable to be represented by a spatial model if that spatial model is too low dimensional. And there may be other sort of fundamental hard constraints on whether these models are sort of capable of expressing the relationships between people that we would like them to. The second set of open questions relates to how you characterize the sort of health of relationships in a population. So you don't need to worry too much about the details of this table, but this is a big survey of metrics for polarization based on sort of formal models that were on the previous slide. And there's significant questions about whether any of the existing metrics for polarization that have been proposed are appropriate to serve as something that can be optimized. Most optimizing for many of them would simply reduce all opinions to a single point, which is probably not what we want. We need to understand which are valid or how to align them with the type of social cohesion or lack of polarization that we are interested in. We need to understand the computational complexity of them. Are they able to be sort of deployed at scale in a large social network? Do they provide numbers which are comparable across contexts, across countries, between platforms, that kind of thing. A more ad hoc approach to bridging is to use heuristics to identify content which is in some sense bridging divides. A common one is the sort of diverse approval heuristic, where that's the idea that if two people who would normally disagree about something are agreeing about something or endorsing or supporting it, then that's a strong signal of content that is bridging divides. But there's others. We have very little information about how valid these are, whether they actually sort of causally are related to an improvement in human relationships that we care about. We are not sure how common these are in practice. If we were to prioritize ranking each of these highly in a recommender system, would there be enough examples to make a meaningful difference? To what extent does incentivizing them or adding them to the value model of a recommender system incentivize people to create more of them? An economic way of framing that would be something like, what is the value model elasticity of social cohesion for a given heuristic? And to what extent are these valid across contexts where human relationships and things like approval or endorsement online might be expressed differently? Finally, it's important to recognize that attention allocators exist in a sort of stack of optimizers. They themselves optimize for value according to their own intrinsic definition of attention worthiness, but they use models that are optimized for accuracy. They're built by people optimizing for their own interests and the interests of their stakeholders, and they're used by people who are optimizing for their own ends. So there's questions related to how these systems could be abused, what might be unwanted side effects of bridging, whether things like optimizing for the diverse approval heuristic might be unethical because perhaps it only sort of highlights mainstream ideas and silences marginal voices. So yeah, lots of open questions there. There's a lot of momentum behind this work. It was covered in the Washington Post a few days ago. If you go to that website, you'll find the whole working paper and that big survey of polarization metrics I measured earlier. If you're interested in any of this, please come and talk to Aviv or myself. Thanks.
Thanks, Luke. Next up, we have Glenn.